Este evangelho é parte de ciclo.
This gospel is part of a cycle of narratives about the passion of Christ that intend to absolve the Romans of guilt for the crucifixion and place it entirely on the Jews.
Sobre os judeus.
This intention is also noted in the canonical Gospels, especially in John's. It is important to remember that seeking someone to blame for the condemnation and death of Christ may be a waste of time. After all, how can we blame the Jews when those who followed and defended Jesus were also Jews? Moreover, Jesus himself was Jewish. Blaming Pilate and the Roman Empire may also be senseless because he was just doing his job of maintaining the Roman peace, which exempts him from any individual blame and portrays him as a mere puppet of the oppressive Roman system in Judea at the time of Christ. This gospel has come down to us in various versions and languages, and its composition is estimated to be between the 4th and 5th centuries. The narrative is quite straightforward and more modern, like a spin-off of the canonical gospel accounts. Here, we see what happened in more detail, the dialogues and negotiations between Pilate and the Jews, and more details about other secondary characters like Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, as well as new characters not found in the canonical Gospels. The word apocryphal comes from the Greek apokryphos, meaning hidden. In literature, the term is commonly used to designate those books that were kept in secrecy, and in bibliology, it is used to identify religious works of the early church that lacked canonical authority, meaning they were not read in public worship because they were not considered the word of God given to men. It is worth remembering that the term apocryphal should not be considered pejorative, as its content may contain truths, whether theological or historical. Apocryphal Gospels are texts written at different times, with many belonging to the early church and others to the medieval period. This series will present only comments, curiosities, and references about these texts, a guide to introduce the themes and to stimulate interest in deepening knowledge about the history of salvation. The full texts can be found freely on the internet, and for this series, the translation by Professor Federico Lorenzo of the University of Coimbra, published in 2022, was used. The Gospel of Nicodemus, Acts of Pilate. This gospel begins with the author, Ananias, identifying himself as a member of the procurator's guard and a baptized Christian who, upon gaining access to the records written by the Jews in the time of Christ, translated them into Greek so that everyone could read them. The author, Ananias, provides interesting historical details. This gospel was written in the 17th year of the Emperor Flavius Theodosius, and the events reported here took place in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Emperor of the Romans, and in the 19th year of the reign of Herod, King of Galilee. During this period, Joseph Caiaphas was the high priest. The author also asserts that the Hebrew redaction was made by Nicodemus, a famous figure who appears in chapter 3 of the canonical Gospel of John. The first scene narrated in this Gospel takes place in a meeting, possibly in the Praetorium, where the priests and scribes request Pilate to interrogate Jesus because he has committed many crimes against Jewish law, such as healing on the Sabbath and proclaiming himself the Son of God and King of the Jews. Pilate, initially reluctant to accept, eventually agrees and instructs his messenger to bring Jesus to him, but to do so with gentleness. The messenger, upon calling Jesus, throws a handkerchief he had in his pocket for Jesus to walk on. The Pharisees, seeing what the messenger did, become enraged and question Pilate, who asks the messenger, "Why did you do that?" The messenger says that a few days ago, when he was sent to Jerusalem, he saw Jesus sitting on a donkey while the children acclaimed him as king. The priests ask how he, being Greek, could understand children shouting in Hebrew, and he replies that a Jew translated it for him. Pilate ensures that the translator speaks the truth by asking him to repeat the phrase in Hebrew, and upon confirming the information, he orders Jesus to be brought. When Jesus passes by the standard bearers, the tops of the standards bow down, reverencing him. The Jews become angry with the standard bearers, and Pilate asks, "Doesn't the fact that the standards bow to Jesus amaze you?" The Jews then claim that it was the standard bearers who bowed them. Pilate questions the standard bearers, and they emphasize that they are Greek slaves of the temple and have no reason to venerate him. Pilate then tells the Jews to choose capable and strong men to hold the standards while Jesus enters, to prove if the Greeks were telling the truth. Pilate also states that if the standards do not bow down, the Greeks will lose their heads. The Jews choose 12 strong and capable men, and when they carry the standards, the situation repeats itself when Jesus is brought. Here again, we observe the presence of the 12 men chosen to bear the standards, just like the 12 disciples and the 12 tribes of Israel. Pilate is worried about what he has just seen, and before rising, he receives a message from his wife, telling him not to meddle with this man, referring to Jesus, because she suffered greatly for him during the night. This account of Pilate's wife is also present in the canonical Gospel of Matthew, chapter 27, verse 19. Pilate tells the Jews about what his wife has just told him, and they respond that Jesus, being a sorcerer, sent his wife a nightmare. Pilate asks Jesus why these Jews accuse him and why he remains silent. Jesus replies that they speak because they have the authority to do so, and they can say both good and bad things. They will see for themselves, says Jesus. The elders then respond to Jesus by questioning his authority to speak to them in such a way. They say, first, you were born of prostitution, second, your birth caused a massacre of babies in Bethlehem, and third, your parents fled to Egypt because they could not face the people. Some Jews there, described by the author as pious, say they know that Joseph was engaged to Mary and, therefore, Jesus was not born of prostitution. Pilate then affirms that they are attacking Jesus with false testimony, and the Jews say that those who defend him there are Greeks converted to Judaism and were disciples of Jesus. Those who defend Jesus then object and say they are the sons of Jews and were present at the wedding of Joseph and Mary. For many people, this identity argument among them, Latinos, Jews, and Greeks may seem strange, but it was quite common in that context, as we are talking about the Levantine territory previously occupied by the Greeks and with profound Hellenic influences and at that time dominated by the Romans. We can again cite the canonical Bible, where in the book of Acts, we learn about various Greeks converted to Judaism and later to Christianity, with a focus on Stephen, considered the first Christian martyr. After a discussion between Pilate, the Jews, and the 12 Jews who defended Jesus, who, remembering, were not the disciples because the author cites their 12 names in the Gospel, Pilate questions the 12, "Why do you want to kill him?" They respond that it is because Jesus performed healings on the Sabbath, which leaves Pilate indignant, and he repeats to the Jews, "I find no guilt in this man." This questioning by Pilate regarding Jesus' guilt is also present in the canonical Gospels. The Jews then say that if Jesus were not guilty, they would not have brought him to Pilate. Pilate says that they should take him and judge him according to Jewish law, but they respond that they are not permitted to execute anyone. This account is also in the Gospel of John, chapter 30, and what follows is quite similar, but with more details. Pilate then ironically asks the Jews, "God said that you cannot kill, but can I?" Pilate asks Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus replies, "Are you saying this on your own or did others tell you about me? Am I not a Jew, then? Your own people and the chief priests handed you over to me. What have you done?" The dialogue continues, and Jesus says that his kingdom is not of this world because if it were, his followers would have fought to prevent him from being handed over. When questioned by Pilate if he is a king, Jesus affirms that Pilate is saying so, and that he was born and came so that everyone who is in truth hears his voice. Here, finally, we have Jesus' response that is absent in the Gospel of John. When asked by Pilate what truth is, Jesus replies, "Truth from heaven. On earth, there is no truth." Pilate asks. Jesus replies, "Do you see how those who speak the truth are judged by those who have authority on earth?" This statement by Christ is very interesting. Who has never felt deeply unjust in this life? Who has never felt that the truth seems to have no place in this world, that lies prosper, and truth dies every day? In Socrates' Apology, made in 339 BC, the philosopher says that his accusers told the lies so convincingly that he himself almost became convinced that he was guilty. You who feel unjustly treated are not only not alone but also in good company.
Mas também está em muito boa companhia. Pilatos deixa Jesus sozinho no pretório.
Pilate leaves Jesus alone in the praetorium and tells the Jews again, "I find no guilt in him." The Jews reinforce the accusations against Jesus, saying what is also recorded in Matthew 27 verses 24 to 25, "Let his blood be upon us and upon our children." Pilate continues trying, saying that Jesus did nothing deserving death. The Jews respond that if it is lawful for someone who blasphemes against Caesar to be punished with death, the same punishment is lawful for one who blasphemes against God. Pilate speaks to Jesus again, who affirms that what is happening was already announced by the prophets, about his death and resurrection. The Jews demand crucifixion, basing their request on the desire of the people, but Pilate looks at the crowd and sees some people weeping and says that not everyone wants Jesus to be condemned. Nicodemus, taking the floor, repeats Gamaliel's speech in Acts 5 verses 38 to 39, "If the signs he performs are from God, they will remain, if they are human, they will perish." The Jews accuse Nicodemus, saying that he is now a disciple of Jesus, and Nicodemus replies, "Has the governor also become his disciple and makes a speech in his favor?" The rhetorical question here clearly defends the truth regardless of any feelings. Whatever the creed or ideology, Jesus' teachings constitute a universal truth for human salvation, for their liberation.
Vários judeus começam a pedir a palavra e a dar testemunho favorável a Jesus.
Several Jews begin to ask for the floor and give favorable testimony to Jesus, the paralyzed man whose healing was described in the four canonical Gospels, in Matthew 9 verses 1 to 8, Mark 2 verses 1 to 12, Luke 5 verses 17 to 26, and John 5 verses 1 to 9. Also, the blind man to whom Jesus restored sight, the hunchback whom Jesus straightened, and the leper who was also cured by Jesus. The Jews ask on what day these people were healed, and the paralyzed man responds that it was on the Sabbath, to which the Jews reaffirm, "He performs healings and casts out demons on the Sabbath." And a certain woman, named Berenice, said she was healed of a flow of blood she had had for 12 years just by touching the hem of Jesus' garment, as reported in Matthew 9 verses 18 to 26 and Luke 8 verses 40 to 56. The Jews respond, saying that they have a law that prohibits a woman from giving testimony. It is true that reading this gospel, like reading any account of any unjust trials in any era, is despairing. The arguments of those who tell the truth seem to have no force over the lies, even though when we are reading, everything seems so absurdly obvious. Here we have two powers, one Jewish, which does not allow the performance of any activity considered work on the Sabbath day, or Saturday, a law questioned by Jesus several times in the canonical and apocryphal Gospels, nor do they accept the testimony of a person solely based on their gender, in this case, female. On the other hand, we have the Roman authority, which holds the dictatorial power to condemn a person to the slow and humiliating death of crucifixion for actions such as criticizing the emperor. Pilate begins to despair because he doesn't want to commit an injustice or incite a rebellion. He needs to maintain the Roman peace to keep himself in office. As in the canonical Gospels, Pilate follows the tradition of releasing a slave during the Jewish Passover and offers the crowd a choice between Barabbas and Jesus. The people choose Barabbas, insisting that Jesus should be crucified.
Pilatos, indignado, diz que este povo
Indignant, Pilate declares the people seditious and washes his hands, echoing Matthew 27 verse 24.
de Mateus capítulo 27, versículo 24.
Privately, Pilate informs Jesus of his condemnation, flogging and crucifixion, along with the two criminals, Dismas and Gestas.
Dismas e Gestas sejam crucificados com ele.
Interestingly, Pilate states that Jesus will be crucified in the garden where he was arrested, not at Golgotha as described in the canonical Gospels.
Evangelhos canônicos.
Jesus is crucified and asks his Father to forgive his tormentors, echoing Luke 23 verse 34.
23, versículo 34. Os sacerdotes zombam de
The priests mock Jesus, taunting that he saved others but cannot save himself. The soldiers do the same, offering him vinegar. A sign reading, Jesus Nazarenus Rex Iudiorum, is hung on Jesus' cross in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, as traditionally depicted in art.
retratado nas artes. O malfeitor Gestas
The criminal Gestas challenges Jesus, saying that if he is the Christ, he should save himself and them. Dismas rebukes him, acknowledging their just condemnation but asserting Jesus' innocence. Dismas asks Jesus to remember him in his kingdom, and Jesus promises they will be together in paradise that day.
eles estariam juntos no paraíso. Uma escuridão cobriu
Darkness covers the land, and Jesus breathes his last. The centurion present recognizes Jesus as a just man and reports this to Pilate, who, along with his wife, is saddened.
junto à sua mulher, se entristece. Ao questionar aos judeus,
When questioned by the Jews, they claim it was a normal eclipse. A friend of Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea, requests Jesus' body from Pilate and buries him in a new tomb cut from rock.
o túmulo ser novo é dado
The fact that the tomb is new is significant, as Jews typically reinterred bodies after a period in ossuaries.
seus entes em caixas chamadas ossuários. Os judeus
The Jews, upon learning that Joseph had asked for Jesus' body, sought him out and threatened him. Joseph tells them that, since they took responsibility for the blood of the just one who was Jesus, they would be punished by God for what they did.
pelo que fizeram.
Furious, they imprison Joseph of Arimathea in a windowless house, with doors, and seal the entrance. On Saturday morning, they meet in the synagogue and deliberate on how he would be executed. When they go to fetch him to appear before them in judgment, they do not find him inside the house. Frightened, they temporarily give up on pursuing those who testified favorably about Jesus.
Favorável a Jesus. Quando os judeus
When the Jews were gathered in the synagogue, the soldiers they had placed to guard the tomb arrived, reporting what they had just seen.
o que acabaram de ver. Houve terremoto.
There was an earthquake, and an angel descended from heaven, rolled the stone sealing the tomb, and sat upon it. The guards, paralyzed with fear, witnessed the scene. The angel told the women present that Jesus had risen and was already in Galilee.
E que estava já na Galileia. Tudo isso ocorreu à meia-noite.
All this occurred at midnight, and the elders gathered the necessary sum to bribe the guards so they would not tell anyone what they had seen, but rather say that the body was stolen by Jesus' followers while they slept.
Jesus enquanto eles dormiam. Já no capítulo 14 deste
In chapter 14 of this gospel, 3 men descended to Jerusalem. They were Phinehas, a priest, Adas, a teacher, and Andrew, a Levite.
eles contam aos
They told the synagogue leaders that on the way, they saw Jesus and his disciples on a mountain called Mamilk, and there they heard Jesus instructing his disciples, and as he spoke, he was lifted up into heaven.
foi levantado para o céu. Os sacerdotes os obrigam a jurar sobre as escrituras sagradas.
The priests forced them to swear on the sacred scriptures, and they maintained their version.
Alimento e dinheiro
The priests gave them food and money, and they returned to Galilee.
entre eles.
Then, among themselves, they hinted that the disciples probably bribed the guards to say that the angel descended from heaven and that Jesus resurrected, and later stole the body. Still, They could not explain what was reported by the men who came from Jerusalem and saw Jesus with his disciples. Nicodemus then speaks, addressing the Sanhedrin, that these three men fear God and reported that Jesus was taken up to heaven just like Elijah. Remembering that Elijah was sought among the mountains after being taken up because the people did not believe this story, Nicodemus suggests that Jesus should also be sought among the mountains of Israel. Jesus was not found, but they found Joseph of Arimathea right at his home, in Arimathea. The priests sent messengers to him, saying they were repentant and that he was a righteous man. The Jewish clergy restored friendship with Joseph, and asked him, under oath, to tell what happened to him, how he managed to escape the confinement that was previously imposed on him. Joseph tells them that while he was praying, he felt the house where he was being lifted by its four corners, and he saw a light as bright as lightning. When, frightened, he fell to the ground. He says he felt someone take his hand and that he was freed from inside the confinement by Jesus himself, who proves to him who he is by taking him to the tomb and showing him that it is empty. Jesus leaves him inside his own house, in Arimathea, and tells him not to leave there for the next 40 days, because he will go to Galilee. The priests were perplexed by the account, and fasted until the beginning of the Sabbath. The clergy of the Sanhedrin then gather various witnesses, including a student of the late Simeon, the same one who blessed Jesus at birth, and also the three men who saw Jesus on the way from Galilee to Jerusalem. Interrogating each of the three men separately, they confirmed that they were telling the truth. They continued discussing the earlier prophets whose bodies were not found and were not buried because they were taken up, like Enoch, Moses, and Elijah. They cannot prove that Jesus is a fraud, and, surrendering, they accept that if the memory of Christ lasts for a certain number of years, he will prevail and form for himself a new people. The priests speak to the people of Israel reaffirming God's sovereignty over the nation, and the people sing hymns of praise to the Lord, God of Israel. This gospel makes it quite clear the desire to completely disconnect Judaism from Christianity, often sounding exaggerated and caricatured in the portrayal of Jews, but it is important to remember that in the canonical Bible we already find many self-criticisms made by them, and we also see the sufferings that the people of Israel endure as a punishment from God for breaking the covenant. In John 11 verses 47 to 50, a dialogue is reported that recalls the debates found in this apocryphal text. Then gathered the chief priests and the Pharisees a council, and said, What do we? For this man doeth many miracles. If we let him thus alone, all men will believe on him, and the Romans shall come and take away both our place and nation. And one of them, named Caiaphas, being the high priest that same year, said unto them, Ye know nothing at all. Nor consider that it is expedient for us, that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation perish not. And as an example that the Jews indeed had this kind of debate and fear among them, since the prophets of the past prophesied as harshly or even more so than Christ, we have this passage from the prophet Amos 5 verses 21 to 24. I despise your feast days, and I will not smell in your solemn assemblies. Though ye offer me burnt offerings and your meat offerings, I will not accept them, neither will I regard the peace offerings of your fat beasts. Take thou away from me the noise of thy songs, for I will not hear the melody of thy viols. But let judgment run down as waters, and righteousness as a mighty stream. The impression left is that Jesus never intended to found a new religion rooted in Judaism, but as we already know, he was not accepted by his own, and history took its course. The search for a culprit for the unjust condemnation and death of Jesus is perhaps a waste of time, since Jesus himself forgave all those who wronged him right there on the cross. Furthermore, how to pinpoint the guilty party? Would it be Judas, who betrayed him, the Pharisees, who conspired, the disciples, who were passive, the Roman authorities, who succumbed to pressure for injustice just to maintain the Pax Romana? Could the blame not lie in this unequal and unjust system in which we live, where a few powerful individuals can, without any commitment to justice, decide the fate of almost everyone? May the good news of Christ bring us, at least, the desire for an unrelenting pursuit of justice among men. This documentary has no intention of stirring up controversy on the subject, because there is no reason to do so. For a long time, the apocryphal texts have sparked more discussions about whether they should be read or not, rather than the actual reading and reflection on these texts. They are part of the history of the Church and of Christianity, just like the other books of the Christian Bible, and in them, we find the roots of many Christian traditions around the world. It is also interesting to remember that the Christian Bible differs among the many Christian denominations because there are differences between the Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant Bibles in the number of books in each canon. To understand and reflect on the apocryphal texts, one must do the same exercise as studying the Bible and any other historical writing, understand the time, the place, the culture, the language, in short, the historical context. There are things that were common 100 years ago that would be unacceptable today, so it can be assumed that when talking about things that were written 2,000 years ago, the shock would be even greater, which is not exclusive to the Bible or religion, but rather to history. So, in the case of this series, which will only deal with the Apocryphal Gospels, we have the opportunity to consult other sources about the people who lived with Christ and also about him. Since there is a fact here that does not differ from the canonical Gospels, everything that was written about Christ was written by people who were around him and by the communities founded by these and other people. Jesus himself left nothing in writing. And I say only the Apocryphal Gospels, because there are also books from the Old Testament and epistles that are apocryphal. The curiosity about the facts of Christ's life and the origins of religion and Christian traditions is present in various groups in our society. The series was made with the intention of satisfying some of the endless interest in this undoubtedly greatest historical figure of humanity.